This move immediately stakes a claim in the center, controlling key squares and preparing to develop pieces efficiently. This move, Nf6, is a very flexible developing move, common in many Indian defenses, controlling central squares and preparing for further pawn advances or piece development while avoiding immediate commitment to a specific pawn structure. This move develops a knight towards the center, preparing to castle and supporting a potential c4 push to control the queenside space. This move solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to develop the king's bishop, a common and solid response in many Indian defenses, aiming for a flexible setup. This move strategically prepares for solid development by supporting the d4 pawn and opening a diagonal for the queen's bishop, aiming for a robust king's Indian attack or queen's pawn game structure. This move introduces central tension and challenges white's d4 pawn, aiming to disrupt white's symmetrical setup and open lines for piece activity. Developing the bishop to d3 supports the central pawn advance and prepares for kingside castling, aligning with common development schemes in queen's pawn openings to control key central squares. This capture clarifies the central pawn structure, opening the c-file for potential pressure and allowing black to develop their pieces more freely. White recaptures the pawn on d4, establishing a central pawn presence and opening the e-file for potential future piece activity. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop to b7, aiming to control the long diagonal and pressure white's d4 pawn. This move secures the king's safety and prepares to mobilize the queenside pieces, facilitating a harmonious development in this Catalan-like structure where white aims for central control and black seeks active piece play. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to influence the central squares and support potential queenside expansion. This move reinforces the central pawn chain and prepares to challenge black's control of the d5 square, aiming for a solid positional advantage. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies the kingside and prepares for castling, fitting naturally into the queen's gambit decline structure black has adopted. This move prepares to bring the other knight into play and supports a future advance of the e-pawn, while maintaining a solid central pawn structure. The move 00 is a logical and essential step, completing kingside development and bringing the king to safety behind a pawn shield, which is standard practice in most openings to prepare for middle game operations. This move prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop to b2, creating a strong diagonal pressure along the long a1-h8 diagonal. This move bravely challenges white's central pawn control, aiming to open lines and activate black's pieces, a common theme in queen's pawn openings when white opts for a more solid setup. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the long light squared diagonal and potentially support a central pawn advance or pressure black's queenside. The move nc6 develops the knight to its natural square, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially support a d4 push or activate the knight for further play. This move centralizes the queen, preparing to support the e4 pawn advance and potentially coordinate with the other pieces for a kingside attack or central control. This move connects the rooks and prepares to challenge white's central pawn majority while also eyeing the h2 square as a potential target for the bishop. This move activates the rook, aiming to control the d-file, which is becoming increasingly central and contested after white's capture on d4 and black's pawn push to d5. This move develops the rook to its most active potential, preparing to contest the open c-file, which will become crucial as pawn tension eases. Rethinking the defensive setup. This move reinforces the e4 pawn and prepares for potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvers on the kingside, aiming to consolidate white's central control. This move aims to provoke concessions from white's central pawn structure or activate the queen onto a more aggressive central diagonal. This move prepares to develop the king's knight to g2, aiming to reinforce the kingside and potentially prepare for a kingside attack, while also defending against any immediate threats on the kingside. The queen strategically retreats to h6, avoiding the g3 pawn advance and preparing to eye the kingside, potentially coordinating with the knight on f6. This move repositions the queen to a more central and flexible square, supporting the potential advance of the g-pawn and preparing for further queenside action by freeing the f1 square for a knight or bishop. Black reinforces the d5 pawn and prepares to contest the central open file, aiming to activate the rook and potentially challenge white's queenside initiative. This move aims to prevent black's bishop from accessing the active g4 square and simultaneously prepares for a potential kingside pawn advance. The move 16, b-flat 4, challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to exchange the bishop for a knight, potentially creating a more favorable pawn structure for black after white recaptures with a pawn. This move repositions the rook from the central file to a potentially more active diagonal, supporting the pawn advance on the queenside and preparing to contest the important e-file. Exchanging the bishop for the knight simplifies the position for black, which can be beneficial when aiming to equalize or attack on the queenside by opening lines. This recapture on d2 opens the d-file for the rook, creating pressure against black's queenside pawns and potentially challenging for control of the central files in this queen's Indian defense structure. This move, nb4, challenges white's bishop on d3 and aims to activate the knight by potentially exchanging it for a key defensive piece or occupying a strong outpost on c2. This move knight maneuver initiates a strategic advance, aiming to occupy the strong e5 square, potentially controlling key central squares and preparing for further action against black's kingside or queenside. This move exchanges the bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and potentially opening the d-file for white's rook after white recaptures with the rook. This recapture on d3 regains the material lost and activates the rook to potentially pressure the queenside pawns, while also preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside. The knight strategically repositions to the central outpost, aiming to control key squares and potentially disrupt white's coordination. This move repositions the rook to an active file, eyeing potential discoveries and preparing to contest the open file if black decides to exchange on d3. This move initiates a critical pawn break to challenge white's central pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces. This move 22, ing4, aims to challenge black's misplaced knight on e4, forcing a decision and potentially creating weaknesses around black's king if the knight is exchanged or retreats. Black's queen retreats from the kingside to g5, repositioning to eye the weakened light squares around white's king and potentially support a central pawn push or piece activity. This knight retreat prepares for a potential kingside advance and repositions the knight to a more flexible square for defense or future kingside play. This move is a decisive pawn sacrifice that aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and potentially the rooks, targeting the weakened kingside. This pawn capture on c4 opens up the b-file for white's rook and challenges black's central pawn majority, potentially leading to a more dynamic pawn structure. Black captures the pawn on c4, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the open c-file, though this allows white to recapture and potentially gain the initiative. This dynamic pawn thrust aims to exploit the unprotected c4 pawn and open lines towards black's kingside by creating a passed d-pawn. Black recaptures the pawn, opening the d-file for white's rook and potentially activating the knight to e4 or f5, aiming to disrupt white's central control and create counterplay. This knight maneuver aims to redeploy the knight from the less active kingside to a more central square, potentially supporting a pawn push or preparing to contest the newly opened d-file. This move aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, eyeing the weak g3 pawn and potentially disrupting white's king safety or central control.